Okay, it's, what is it, Tuesday. We have Jon Davidann from HPU. He's a history professor and director of the history department, I guess, and he's here to talk about something that is all over the news, that is Brexit. And let me say that you can't talk about it enough. And Jon puts a very special turn on it because he's going to help us put it in historical context. Welcome to the show, Jon.
Thanks, Jay. Thanks for having me on.
So this was extraordinary. It all caught us all behind the ear by surprise. Never would have thought it would have happened. I would have thought it was something like the Scotland thing where, you know, it's threatening, but then it dissolves. Not true. What happened in Britain to make this happen?
Yeah, I mean, my read on it, and many commentators, they're pointing to the immigration crisis in Europe. And the fact, of course, the EU has open borders, so immigrants can flow into Europe without a check and well, there's checks, but without somebody saying, no, you can't come in. That's the Schengen Agreement of the European Union. So it's open borders. And I think the immigration issue became too much for some parts of the British working class and young people who are afraid that immigrants will take their jobs. So I think the immigration issue has been weighing on Great Britain since the year 2000.
Not without some substance there. I mean, it's costing Germany a lot of money to support the immigrants.
Yeah.
And the immigrants haven't always behaved properly. There have been incidents. And Hanover, I remember a few months ago, there was a problem in January.
Yeah, there were several German cities where there were attacks.
Yeah.
It was very bad. So.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the Brits were looking across the channel and seeing this and saying, we don't want that to happen here.
Yeah, I think so. But of course, even before this, there were some incidents with immigrants in the UK. And a large number of immigrants, about 850,000 in the last 10 years. So that's a big chunk of people. So I think there was, I think some Brits just voted their fear. And their fear of immigrants, taking over, fear of immigrants destroying their way of life, fear of immigrants taking their jobs. So I think the immigration was a big issue. Obviously, there were other, the Labor left, they simply were, the Labor leader was unenthusiastic in support of the EU, and truly he knew that some of his constituents were actually dead set against it, because the British Labor is worried about losing jobs to to other parts of the EU, to lower labor markets, lower cost labor markets. So
you described the situation where the left doesn't like it and the right doesn't like it. And the center is sort of migrating either to the left or the right.
Well, of course, it was a close vote. It was 4 points. And so there was a big yes vote as well. And then there's, there's people who are new to politics, young people. And, we heard of this big protest vote, right? And then these protesters, they didn't think it had a chance of the no votes of actually succeeding. And when it did succeed, now they've become the regretters.
Yeah, really.
And it's just like, really?
This is sort of an opera of a sort, tragic in the end.
I mean, this is real serious stuff. It's just hard to imagine. One of the surprising things to me is the British public, and I've been there many times, and you get on a train in Great Britain and everybody's reading a book, very well educated, the people I meet at least, and how could have this happened? But I guess apparently I've not seen a good bit of England, the part of England that voted no, So.
And there was something in the paper today about how the Brits, even after recognizing this might have been a huge mistake, are criticizing the Europeans and the Americans, anybody not British. What is exactly on them? That's not the mark of an educated society.
Yeah, but there is, so there's a couple things going on there. There are Brits who are feeling, they have felt all along that the EU is going to take too much sovereignty away from Great Britain, right? They've been fighting this issue of sovereignty for a couple of decades. And those folks voted against it because they're British nationalists, and they believe that there are essential values that the British are losing and essential powers that the British government is losing.
They don't want Brussels telling them what to do.
That's exactly right. And so there's that. And then you have some of these immigrants over the last several decades actually voted against this. They voted no, and they were essentially voting against new immigrants coming in, but they voted no maybe because they've become British nationalists themselves. Maybe the acculturation of Great Britain has taken place.
Say they voted no, you mean they voted?
They voted no. They didn't want to remain.
Yeah.
Yeah, they voted on the no side, and this is what happens with older first and second generation immigrants is they become more integrated. Sometimes they embrace nationalism even more than other Brits who are not immigrants because they feel like, okay, this is my adopted home. Everything that I've earned and have gotten is in this country, and so you see some of that phenomenon.
You see it in Hawaii.
You see
the
it.
The most recent immigrant to Hawaii doesn't want anybody to follow him.
Exactly. Yeah. And so there's all kinds of issues going on with those. With the no vote. It's very complex, but it's clearly, to me, it seems like if there had been, if there had been better education on the yes side about the propaganda that was going on the no side, this wouldn't have passed.
Yeah, and that's the interesting point. I mean, to compare against other elections, including our national election, is that people can be misinformed en masse.
Right.
By the media taking one raw meat position or another, and by social media extending and multiplying that effect. Right. And then we find out that millions of people all have the wrong idea.
Yeah. So the fact checking, there wasn't a whole lot of fact checking in the campaign. Now in an American presidential election, there's quite a bit of fact checking, right? So the journalists have learned their lesson here. They haven't learned their lesson yet in Great Britain. So Boris Johnson, he used to be the mayor of London. He was a no leader, and he promised that the British would get all kinds of money that's currently going to the EU, and 350 million would come back to Great Britain. And after the vote, he denied it. He said, "Oh, that was wrong," or "That was, that's not going to happen."
Been affected by it, though.
So they interviewed a young man who's working at a bakery in a post-industrial city in Great Britain, and he said, "I believed him. I thought he was going to bring all kinds of resources back to England, and now he turns out it's a broken promise."
So where do you put this in the context of history? I mean, it's definitely a major historical event. It's going to have cast a long shadow on the world, in my opinion. But where does it fit historically? Is this the first time we've seen this? Does this have deep historical roots in Britain?
Right. So it's a little tricky to place it historically. I think it's definitely an historic event. So it's real serious. And we historians will be lecturing about it and writing books about it in the future. Part of it is what will happen now is really crucial because Brexit might not have to be a full Brexit. There is a model out there, and the model is Norway. Norway voted against joining the EU, but the government of Norway after that adopted most of the EU's rules. Now they kept their own currency. They can pick and choose which rules they have, but they're part of it, the EU integrated market. So it is possible that the British could negotiate something less than a full Brexit. And that's been talked about quite a bit. I mean, Boris Johnson, he might be the front runner to become the next prime minister when an election will likely take place in the fall. Boris Johnson says, well, we don't want to lose the common market. Well, then, for heaven's sakes, why in the world did you do this? But so he thinks he can negotiate a British place continuing in the European common market, and that's possible. The thing is, the Europeans now are the continental Europeans are pretty unhappy about
and offended. They were rejected by their.
I think the best negotiating position the British had was when David Cameron last winter said, "Oh my gosh, look at what's happening. This could go the wrong way," and went to the EU and said, give me some compromises. And they did. They were small compromises. But he came back, and maybe he didn't get enough compromises. But I think that was the moment when the British had some leverage, when it looked like it could go. Now that the vote has been taken, I think they've lost quite a bit of their leverage with the EU. So,
yeah. I mean, I don't know about the leaders, but the people certainly don't like what happened. They don't like being rejected this way. You don't like our deal. You don't want to be with us. Then you must be. You know, we're gonna show you how bad it can be.
Yeah. I mean, I've heard some reports on both sides. I've heard some kind of, oh, those British, right? And I've also heard some reports. Well, no, that we still welcome them. You know, that they're still a part of Europe. So it's part of it is that the British have never came completely to grips with a European identity in addition to a British identity.
And that goes deep.
And that's real serious business that goes to nationalism and the creation of the country and everything. But interesting, right? Scotland voted big majorities in favor of remaining, right? They voted, we want to remain. And the way it's been, I didn't really understand this because, of course, the Scottish are fairly nationalistic, right? They want their own nation. They held a referendum a couple of years ago to have their own nation, so it didn't make sense to me. It's like, why are the Scottish, why do they want to remain? They're nationalists, right? They want their own country, don't they? The Scottish have a better, maybe more sophisticated idea of how their identities fit together. They definitely have, Scottish nationalism. But they also see themselves as Europeans, and that most Scots do not see that as conflicting with the Scottish identity, to have a European identity. It was described as, those Russian dolls that fit inside one another.
The egg dolls.
Yes, that was the description of how the Scottish think about their identity with Europe, with British, and with Scottish. So the Scottish are very unhappy about this. This might also lead to a Scottish independence vote.
Well, they have another vote right now. I think they'd vote to secede from the UK.
Right now, yeah, absolutely they would. So
and join the EU.
Yeah, that's right. I think there are other benefits, right? So small states get the benefit of being connected to bigger states, bigger markets, and with the Scottish, it's almost their beef is with British nationalism, and historically with the British. Their beef is not with Europe, and I think in some ways they see that European identity and European connections might be a bulwark against the British. So that was a surprise to me.
Yeah, so there's a tension within the UK. Call it the UK, under the hood is not so UK.
Not yet.
It's ununited K.
Right, a little disunited right now. The Northern Ireland wanted to remain. Now Northern and Ireland are talking about a union. Wales was the only kind of part of the Confederation that said, no, we want to leave, and voted that way. So Britain could have a full-scale revolt on their hands.
This is really complicated. 100 years ago, if anybody tried this, I mean, if that is Scotland or Ireland tried this, there'd be a war over it.
Right.
And it would be the American Civil War. You can't leave.
That's right. Yeah.
But now they offer them the opportunity to vote on leaving.
Right.
This is a strange thing to do that.
I would describe it as a post-national age, as an age where nationalism is not so powerful that you're going to fight wars over the kind of not having enough of it or not having the right kind of it. You're not going to fight wars over it, as wars were fought, of course, in the late 19th and into the 20th century. And so even though it's British nationalism that drove a good bit of the Brexit, I still think that what you see in the United Kingdom is that we live in an age where nationalism has been eroded by globalization, global marketplaces, global travel, global interconnection.
We've got to delve into that more right after this break. That's Jon Davidann of HPU, history professor. We're talking about Brexit. We'll be right back. We're going to hit the heart of this thing in a minute.
Aloha, everybody. My name is Mark Shklov. I'd like you to join me for my program, Law Across the Sea, on thinktechhawaii.com. Aloha.
Hello, I'm Marianne Sasaki. Welcome to Think Tech Hawaii, where some of the most interesting conversations in Honolulu go on. I have a show on Wednesdays from 1 to 2 called Life in the Law, where we discuss legal issues, politics, governmental topics, and a whole host of issues. I hope you'll join me.
Hello, I'm Patrick Bratton. I'm the host of Global Connections. I'm also a professor at Hawaii Pacific University, and my show and some of the other things that we do is shows off the collaboration that we have between Think Tech Hawaii and Hawaii Pacific University. So I look forward to seeing you and talking with you about a lot of issues dealing with Hawaii, the United States, and the world. Thank you very much.
One, bingo. Okay, so, looking at the larger picture here, your point a moment ago about how what we see is nationalism has faded in the light of globalism. And, Thomas Friedman talked about this in Flat World a long time ago. And indeed, we've seen it in so many ways, in so many places. Technology and communications, all this makes the world global. And yet, now we see the resurgence of nationalism.
Yeah.
What's going on?
Well, I think part of it is just a reaction against some of the features of globalization. Some of the features of globalization included a strengthened EU and a decline in, national forms of identity. And so there are some who say, wait, that's enough. We don't want to lose that sovereignty. And, some of the discussion by those who wanted to leave was, we're losing our sovereignty. And it's like, okay, that's a very abstract idea. But there's something in their hearts, in their identities that say, we're losing too much of what makes us British. So there still is nationalism there, but I still think that the overall trend line globally is that globalization is eroding these.
The nationalism you described is not the kind of nationalism that I've been thinking about, where, you're rah-rah for your country,
right.
Through thick or thin.
Right.
Because the same people who are calling for nationalism are actually mad at the government.
Right. Right. That's
They're not.
right.
They're not loyal and faithful to the government.
No, that's right.
This is some kind of thing like, just like, let's make America great again.
Yes.
I'm not nationalistic about America today.
Right.
About some other form of America.
Yeah, there's these strong anti-nationalist, anti-patriotic movements in the last 50 years. The 60s.
Yeah.
And afterwards. So how do you appeal to those folks? You say, well, we're bad right now, right? But we might be great in the future. Or, we don't like our government, but we want some sort of British identity. So,
well, there's the whole thing with the American election is a great comparison to this election in Britain.
Yeah.
Because the system wasn't working on the election. The media wasn't doing a good job.
Right.
Social media was perverting things.
Right.
The legislators involved were, on the sidelines or not doing constructive things, doing destructive things.
Yeah.
And it raises the point, and I put it to you, that democracy isn't working like it used to or was intended. The founders would be turning in their grave to see this kind of thing, including the English founders.
Yes and no. Democracy is messy, and actually, the Brexit is democracy in action.
You bet.
So
But it's not exactly what we thought.
It's just the thing is, one person likes the kind of democracy that the results of democracy, and another person doesn't. So, there's a long history in our own country of a kind of populism that sometimes is right wing, sometimes is left wing, that populism has. The good news is it's never ended the way lots of populisms did in the 1930s with other countries, like populism in Germany ended with the election of Adolf Hitler. Populism in Japan ended with the rise of the military and their strengthening.
Or Russia.
Yeah, so you have these other examples of populism where, things really went awry in historical terms. But if you want, I can talk, kind of in historical terms.
Please.
About, So the EU and forms of European-wide cooperation go back quite a long way. They go back to 1914, actually. and the outbreak of World War I, the Germans had a plan. The Germans had a war plan called the Schlieffen Plan, but they also had a peace plan. The Germans believed that if their war plan, the Schlieffen Plan, was successful, they would, within a number of months, have control over France, the lowland countries of, Belgium and the rest, and they would have Russia under control. That border would be controlled by Germany. And industrialists in Germany and politicians then would propose that there be a European-wide economic union called Mitteleuropa.
Oh, how interesting.
Yeah, so this was something cooked up by Walter Rathenau, who was an industrialist in Germany, and he had strong connections in the German government, and so that was their post-war plan. They were going to create an economic union that, of course, would be dominated by Germany, and it would create, a century of peace, but on German terms. It would be capitalist. It would probably not be terribly democratic. Germany would be at the center of it economically. Germany would have access to ports in the lowland countries, and so it was pretty hegemonic. It was like, okay, this sounds a bit like European imperialism within Europe, but nonetheless they described it as a union.
Yeah.
So that was the first proposal of European Union, and of course that didn't work. Germany didn't win in France, and the war got bogged down in the Low Countries, and then you had 4 years of devastation. So, and then really the second time when it gets proposed is after World War II, and this is when it becomes successful. It starts with steel and coal. There's a steel and coal union in 1951, and that involves the big players in Europe, not that many countries, but the French, the British, the Germans, and a few others. And then in 1958, they announce a common market for other. They essentially expanded the free market of coal and steel into other products, and the free flow of other products across borders. So that was the beginnings of really a post-World War II vision.
But Britain wasn't involved at that
Britain
time.
was involved.
What?
Yeah, they
Oh,
were
interesting.
involved. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. And I think everybody believed, all of these major European powers believed that this was an answer to the devastation and the catastrophe of World War II. This was the answer, because now you wouldn't have a Europe squabbling and fighting within. You would have a Europe that was more united.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, in the 1990s, then the Maastricht Treaty, which really intensified the power of the European Union and proposed a European-wide currency, which was then implemented later, I think in about 2000, was when the euro was introduced. So that's just a brief kind of sketch of the history of it, but it started with economics. The Middle Europa, that was an economic union, and the 50s unions, that was about economics.
Yeah.
And
Well, it's still about economics.
it's still
mostly.
about economics.
At the end of the day, I mean, look what happened in the markets. People didn't realize it was so economic.
Right.
But the question I put to you for our remaining
Yeah,
time is,
yeah.
so extend it forward. What's going to happen now? I
Right.
know there's a lot of uncertainty. It's a hard question.
it is a
But
hard
how do you see it evolving over the next, say, 2 years?
Right, right. So I think it really depends upon how the British leadership responds to this. And if the Labour Party goes in and sticks their head in the sand, okay, that's not going to work. If the Conservatives, elect somebody who doesn't know how to negotiate, thinks they can bully the EU, that's not going to work. They're really going to have to be careful. The British people are going to have to be careful in who they choose to lead. Maybe Boris Johnson can do this. Maybe he can negotiate an exit that keeps a common market. The thing is, everybody loses if the British leave a common market. It was, just to make a historical reference, John Maynard Keynes, of course, was at the Paris Peace Conference in 1929 at the end of World War I. He left the conference after 6 weeks because he saw that the major powers, the British and the French, were going to punish Germany. They were going to try to extract immense damages from Germany. And he thought that was just a catastrophic approach. He goes back to England, he writes a book, and by summer of 1919, he's published this book called The Economic Consequences of the Peace. Well, and he says, look, don't punish the Germans, give them a small reparations, because Germany is at the center of this European economy. You punish Germany, you're going to be punishing Britain and France. Much the same is true today.
Yeah.
The British leaving is going to hurt the British the most, but it could hurt France, it could hurt Germany. You know, the European powers might be thinking right now, gee, let's get this over with.
They've said that.
They've
But
said
let me ask you,
because they're afraid that others will do the same thing, right? They're afraid of a
Right.
general revolt
Well,
against the European
that's
Union.
one commentator said that, and I wanted to ask you about that.
Yeah.
What she said was that this is going to actually, in all likelihood, unify the EU without Britain, because they'll see that as a matter of survival, they have to work harder.
Yeah.
They have to work harder to avoid problems among themselves, to
Yeah.
clean up any problems now,
Yeah.
and come together. And when they do that, they will be strong again, or stronger even than they have been. What do you think about that?
I wish I was that optimistic. I think the European Union might see a time of some retrenchment now. I don't think they're going to get stronger. I think you might see the European Union having to make more compromises with other countries and give back some sovereignty, give on the issue of the common currency. You know, the thing is, some of the downsides of an economic union that has well, let's take the upsides first, right? The EU is the largest single market in the world. You know, so it's immense. But the downsides are that with a common currency, then you don't have the same level of economic development in the EU. You have nations that are much less developed, and you have the post-industrial France and Britain and Germany's not he's kind of post-industrial, and so those are highly developed nations, and those nations are much better situated to weather a recession than the less developed nations. And so in the European financial crisis, and after the Great Recession of 2008, then in 2010, Europe went through its own economic crisis.
Yes.
They kind of giggled at the United States and all the problems,
And they suffered themselves.
And then they suffered themselves. So the nations that really suffered were the peripheral nations. Italy, Greece, the East European nations really suffered. Ireland, Spain, Portugal. So it's difficult to have a union in which not all the members are equal in economic terms, and it's difficult for these other members to arrange their economic situations without control over the currency.
Yeah.
They're really dependent upon the European Bank to make currency adjustments. that are
Trade alone
favorable.
is not going to solve this problem.
It's more complicated than trade is crucial.
Yeah.
But currency is a huge issue in Europe, and the thing is, we think about the euro as the common currency, but there's the British pound, there's the French franc, the Norwegian kroner. I mean, there's a lot of nations that have kept their own currency.
One last thing, John.
Yeah.
And that is the U.S. Forgetting about politics for a minute, and
Right.
forgetting about the condition of democracy between here and Britain, just trade.
Yeah.
It seems to me that Britain and the U.S. they're bonded at the hip because of they gave birth to us in their
Yeah,
own way,
yeah.
and we have very strong trade relations with them, and
Yeah.
it's a common language, all that. And one natural possibility is that we would actually be stronger in dealing with them on a trade basis than before. And they would look to us because they can't look so easily to the EU anymore. What do you think is going to happen?
I don't know about that. I mean, it's possible, but I'm not an economist, but I've studied economic history, and what happens when nations begin to put up barriers to trade is that those barriers tend to lead elsewhere to political isolation, to putting up barriers in terms of immigrants, to tensions, and in the 1930s this helped. It created an environment in Europe in which war became much more possible. So I think I'm a free trader. I believe in this because I see the history of it. So I think barriers to free trade are dangerous. And so I don't know that the British will be helped because they have a relationship with the United States. It's all about, what kinds of goods can Great Britain sell here? Not that many, I don't think. Do we get much in terms of British tourism? Not much.
Yeah.
What kind of goods can we sell in Great Britain that we don't? I think there's very few that, those markets have been open for a long time, and so I'm skeptical about that too.
We will see what we will see, and I hope you come back and discuss further with
Yeah.
us as the whole thing I shouldn't say unfolds. We're going to say unravels.
It could unravel.
It could be. Jon Davidann, Global Connections. He's a history professor at HBU down the street, and we're talking about Brexit implications for the UK, Europe, and the US, and we are not finished with this discussion. Thank you so much, Jon.
You bet. Thanks, Jay.